Let's face it, nobody likes being sick. However, regardless of who you are, at some point in time in your life you will be sick, or you'll have some form of injury. In these instances, most of the population will tend to go to the emergency room. However, most of these patients have a sense of frustration while they're waiting to be seen. This is because patients have a love-hate relationship for the emergency department. However, when faced with illness or injury, 9 times out of 10, that's where they'll be found. So why do we go to the emergency room? For the most part, people go to the emergency room for minor injuries and ailments. These range from fever, upset stomach, diarrhea, or even a sprained ankles from playing sports. Regardless of the reason for being there, most people dread going to the emergency room. This is mainly for 2 reasons. One, the long wait periods that people have when going to the emergency department, and 2, that sense of being treated inadequately for the reason that they're there. Now let's start with the wait times. When a person enters an emergency department, they're screened at the desk, and usually within 15 to 30 minutes they are screened and triaged. Now initially this doesn't seem like a long period of time until you start to understand what the triage categories are. Triage categories range from 1 to 5, with 4 and 5 being your minor illnesses and injuries. This is where most people fit in, and they're the ones that have to wait the longest to be seen. As a matter of fact, in an article by Todd Neal, the national wait time in emergency department is over 4 hours. Now the other issue that people have is that sense of feeling they got inadequate treatment for while they're there. Parents will take their children because they have a fever, only to be discharged with Tylenol and Motrin. Someone may show up for tremendous knee pain, only to be sent home with ACE wraps and crutches and told to rest. With diagnosis and treatment such as this, there's a lot of animosity patients have towards the emergency department because they feel that they haven't received the adequate treatment for what they're there for. Now, what if I were to tell you that there is a way to reduce the amount of times you ever had to go to the emergency department? And it's actually quite easy. Let's start with some basic pharmacology. There are certain medications that every person should have in their cabinet. Those are Tylenol, Motrin, Benadryl, Mylanta, Pepto-Bismol, and that's about it. Armed with these medications, some ACE wraps, and some Band-Aids, most people can treat 85% of what they usually go to the emergency department for. Now let me give you some scenarios to show how this works. You wake up one morning and you're running a fever. You're nauseated, you've vomited a couple times, and you're even having some diarrhea. Now the first step would be to take some Tylenol. Tylenol will reduce your fever. And since Motrin requires you to take food, you'd want to take Tylenol. Because you're vomiting, you'd want to increase your fluids. You could do this with 7-Up or ginger ale. And then you'd work into what's called a brat diet. A brat diet meaning banana, rice, applesauce, and toast. These simple foods are easier on your stomach while your stomach starts to settle down and be able to take more food intake. Alright, now vomiting and diarrhea are your body's way of trying to get rid of whatever's making you sick. So initially you don't want to stop these processes, but you do want to control them somewhat. So as you're drinking clear liquids and you're starting a brat diet, you may want to take some Pepto-Bismol to kind of control the diarrhea. About 85% of the time, these simple treatments will take care of these ailments. Now let's do another scenario. You're walking down the street, you trip over something, you fall, you sprain your ankle. Alright, now instead of going to the emergency room, you go home. Now let me clarify this. If there is no obvious deformity, you don't need to go to the emergency room automatically. If it's just sore, swollen, then you would go home. You would take some Tylenol. Tylenol reduces the swelling and the heat that you might feel to the area. And then you would start what's called a RICE therapy. RICE stands for rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And it works like this. Rest means you want to stay off the affected side as much as possible. You would ice the area, and you would do this such as every night you'd sit down for a 1-hour television program. And every time a commercial would come on, you would ice that area for the entire commercial break. And then you'd take the ice off while the program is on. Compression. That'd be using something like an ACE wrap to wrap around it to give you some more support while you had to get up when you had to get up. And then of course the last thing is elevation. You want to raise that extremity above the level of the heart. That means that blood isn't rushing down to the area, causing more swelling and more pain. By doing this treatment, you'll treat approximately 50 to 60% of the time that you have some kind of injury. This treatment will take care of it. Now, not a whole lot of people know a lot of these treatments. And in order to take care of this, it's very simple.